We haven't touched base on Italian clubs in a little bit, so we're going to take a look at one of their giants, which is Internazionale Milano, also known as Inter or Inter Milan, more commonly internationally. Their famed home kit of black and blue vertical stripes gives them the nickname Nerazzurri, or the Black Blues. They're also known as Il Biscione, which means the big grass snake. A blue coiled snake with a man in its mouth is a very common symbol within the city of Milan, and they adapted it as their nickname. This is their kit from 2006-2007. You can place it there with the badge being their generally smaller one, also with the star above it for the amount of titles they have being over 10. They currently have 19 Serie A titles. Had to grab this kit when I saw it because it has Adriano's name on the back of it. One of the best Brazilian talents of the beginning of the century. His career didn't lead up to the amount of talent that he had completely, but he was nicknamed the Emperor in Italy because of the immense stature and immense power he had as a striker of the football from the center forward position. Last on the badge, you can see the founding year of 1908, that being when they split off from what is now known as AC Milan, over differences with some supporters wanting the ability to sign foreign players to the club, a stance that AC Milan was against at the time. This is one of the most successful clubs in all of Italy, and they have two key periods that you really should be aware of as far as success, the first being in the 1960s, a period known as Grande Inter. This being between 1960 and 1967, when their manager, Helenio Herrera, brought a more defensive style of play to the club, which brought about immense success in the country and on the European stage, and this style is called catenaccio, or in Italian, doorbolt. Let me talk about Catenaccio a little bit more because it had an immense effect on Italian clubs during that decade and further on after the style fell out of favor, with Italians getting a reputation as incredible defenders. The style that Inter were playing at the time was 5 defenders at the back, 3 in midfield, and 2 attackers. And you might feel that a little weird with the 5 at the back if you're used to seeing 4 defenders these days. The 5th one in there was called a libero, or essentially a player that you may call a sweeper if you started in American soccer earlier this century. This being a player that sits within the defense, is not assigned to man mark any of the attacking players, but is essentially there to just win the ball back. If the ball goes loose, they have to pick it up and spring counterattacks. They're also there to essentially be a second person to man mark different players if there's somebody that really needs help defensively. So having 4 defenders, each man marking an attacking player from the other team, made for a very strong defensive core. And that libero, the 5th guy at the back there, springing attacks forward and winning the ball back, gave rise to something that wasn't a big part of football until that point, which is counterattacks, quick strikes out of possession return in order to score goals with just a couple touches up the field. So Catenaccio was very dominant for the rest of the 1960s and until it was overtaken by a style of football that had been germinating for the last couple decades, specifically in order to defeat this style. It was called total football. It's world renowned for being played by Ajax Amsterdam of the Netherlands through their manager and player at the time, Johan Cruyff. The idea of this style being taking advantage of different spaces around the pitch, moving different players into different positions to drag a defensive system out of position. Different evolutions of it are probably something that you've seen in recent decades with Barcelona's tiki-taka of passing around very quickly in small passes, as well as the style of play currently at Manchester City, all coming back off of the evolution of total football. Okay, enough of the tactics and back to Inter Milan. So they had a down period in the 1990s into the early 2000s where they had very little success and came out of it by signing a lot of the best attacking talent around the world, especially from Brazil with players like Ronaldo and Adriano coming to the club, all culminating throughout that decade in 2010 when they became the first Italian club to ever win a treble, that being the Champions League, the Coppa Italia, and Serie A. Not just that 2009-2010 season, but the year of 2010 in general was a famed one for the club. Portuguese manager Jose Mourinho was in his last season, moving on to manage Real Madrid after winning that treble. They did also go on to win the Supercoppa Italiana, as well as the FIFA Club World Cup in 2010 in the new season, meaning they had 5 different trophies all at once. A total of 8 Coppa Italias, 7 Supercoppa Italiana, as well as internationally winning the Champions League a total of 3 times and the UEFA Cup 3 times, meaning that alongside their city rivals and Derby della Madonnina rivals, AC Milan, they are probably the most successful international Italian clubs. Derby della Madonnina, which is named after the Virgin Mary statue that sits atop the Milan Cathedral, is the biggest match of the season for both of these clubs. They actually share the same stadium, nicknamed San Siro. It is truly known as Stadio Giuseppe Meazza, named after the most important goal scorer all time for Inter Milan. This day is a big derby day for the two clubs. Their fiercest sets of supporters occupy the north and the south curve of the stadium, and they light off flares like mad during this match, so it's usually an incredible atmosphere, and routinely both sides start off with tifos at the beginning of the match, usually to insult the other club. Their big rivalry match and big game of the season is against fellow Northerners Juventus, whom they compete the Derby d'Italia. I've already mentioned a range of other former players for the club, so I'll mention probably the most important one, that being Javier Zanetti, who played an immense 858 times for the club, and probably is one of the best fullbacks of his generation and definitely of this century, even though he could also play in midfield. He's actually still part of the club. He's the vice president, so you'll probably see him on the TV in the stands routinely almost every single match. In the current squad, let's talk about just 3 players. Inter have really rejuvenated themselves as a club in the last couple seasons, primarily through using 2 center forwards at a time. Currently occupying those positions are the tall Bosnian forward Edin Dzeko, as well as the smaller but more mischievous Lautaro Martinez, who has just come off of winning the World Cup with Argentina. And finally, in midfield, I want you to take a look for Nicolo Barella, who's one of the best young Italian talents in that region. So this has been your rundown on Internazionale Milano, also known as Inter, from Italy.